what if the most powerful political weapon in the country right now isn't a march or, a massive riot, but just absolute deafening silence?
It is a profoundly counterintuitive idea. I mean, we're so conditioned to associate political upheaval with noise, right?
Yeah, like clashing with police, chanting through megaphones, flooding city squares.
Exactly. But historically, the most dangerous moment for any sitting government isn't when the streets are full. It's when the machinery of everyday life just quietly stops working.
And that concept, the strategic weaponization of everyday economic participation that is at the absolute center of what we're digging into today. So today we are looking at a truly massive and honestly incredibly polarized stack of sources that you brought in for us. We've got think tank reports from the Center for American Progress, activist coalition pages, internal union resolutions, and even local news comment sections.
Yeah, it's a remarkably diverse collection of documents, which is exactly what you need to understand a movement of this scale.
Right. And our mission for you today, the listener, is to evaluate a very specific thesis threaded through all of this material.
And that thesis is that the No Kings protests are not shrinking following the call for a general strike.
Right, they're actually continuously growing because the underlying political and economic crises driving them are just rapidly worsening.
Okay, let's unpack this, because
Yeah.
what makes this stack of sources so fascinating is just how intensely divided it is.
Oh, absolutely.
And we have activist manifestos painting this movement as this historic, unstoppable awakening right alongside fierce conservative pushback and sharp labor critiques tearing the whole strategy apart.
And we should explicitly state our mandate here. We are not endorsing any side or any policy today.
No, not at all.
We are stepping completely out of the partisan noise to look strictly at the mechanics. We want to report on what the organizers, the critics, and the raw data in these documents are actually saying so that you get the full objective picture.
Right, because it's like a weather system. The weekend marches we saw, those were the scattered storm clouds.
Yeah, but the economic conditions, that's the dropping barometric pressure that is turning this into a sustained, categorized hurricane.
That is a great analogy. But, a feeling of widespread anger doesn't automatically equal a sustained political movement. I mean, we've seen plenty of hashtags and single weekend marches just totally fizzle out.
We have, yeah.
So before we can understand where this is heading, specifically this May 1 general strike that is dominating these documents, we have to test the core premise of the timeline. Is this movement actually growing?
Well, if we look strictly at the timeline mapped out by the Center for American Progress and the reporting from Daily Kos, the trajectory is, frankly, remarkably steep.
Okay, lay the numbers out for us.
So in June of 2025, they tracked an initial baseline of about 5 million people protesting across roughly 2,000 locations.
5 million people. I mean, that is already a staggering logistical achievement for a decentralized movement.
It is, but the acceleration is what really caught researchers' attention. By October 2025, those numbers climbed to 7 million people across 2,700 locations.
And then we hit the record breaker. On March 28, 2026, the movement produced the largest single day in its project history.
Which was how many?
An estimated 8 to 9 million people turned out. And that was across roughly 3,300 locations, hitting all 50 states.
See, here's where it gets really interesting to me. Because generating a massive crowd in New York City or San Francisco, that isn't necessarily a barometer of national sentiment.
Right, you just need a sunny Saturday and a good social media manager for that.
Exactly. But the sources specifically highlight that this is not just a coastal phenomenon. They're tracking significant turnouts in places like Flatwoods, West Virginia, and Chillicothe, Ohio.
Yeah, the rural spread is crucial.
So from a purely mechanical standpoint, does that geographical spread actually matter more than the raw multi-million headcounts?
It matters immensely. I mean, in many ways, the geography is the true threat to the political establishment. The Daily Kos piece features a brilliant quote from Susan Page that gets right to the heart of this.
What does she say?
She notes that the presence of protests in over 3,000 small, rural, and historically conservative towns is an unmistakable display of political force.
Because it shatters the usual political narrative, right? Like when a protest is confined to major liberal hubs, an administration can just easily dismiss it.
Precisely. They can go on television and say, oh, this is just the usual fringe activists making noise.
Right, they isolate the grievance.
Yes. But when a movement penetrates rural West Virginia or small-town Ohio, that signals a systemic, nationwide fracture. I mean, organizing a protest in a town of 1,000 people carries massive social friction.
Because everybody knows everybody.
Exactly. You are protesting in front of your neighbors, your boss, your local sheriff. The fact that people are willing to do that in over 3,000 different communities, it prevents the government from just writing this off as a localized issue. It proves the grievance is structural.
Which, forces us to look at the catalysts. People in rural Ohio or coastal California, they don't just upend their lives, risk their social standing, and take to the streets week after week just for some abstract political theory.
No, they don't.
The pain has to be tangible. It has to be hitting their wallets in a way they can no longer ignore.
And the documents bear that out completely. The mobilization is deeply, inextricably tied to a series of compounding financial crises.
Right.
The Center for American Progress report details this convergence of economic hits that are fundamentally breaking the average household's ability to survive. First, the sources cite a massive sudden spike in healthcare costs.
And that alone destabilizes millions of families.
It does. But then you layer on proposed cuts to SNP benefits.
The Supplemental Nutrition Program.
Right. And the CAP report includes a shocking estimate regarding those specific cuts, projecting they could lead to 70,000 avoidable deaths.
Wait, 70,000?
Yes.
That moves the policy from an economic debate to a literal life or death scenario for the most vulnerable populations.
Absolutely. And the anger is compounded when the public looks at where capital is flowing instead. The documents heavily cite the staggering financial drain of the war in Iran.
Which is costing what, exactly?
The sources say it's costing the public $25 billion per week.
Per week. That is just, it's unfathomable.
It really is. And it's not just the working class feeling the pain. Small businesses are being crushed by supply chain policies, too. The sources highlight new tariffs that are costing small business importers an average of $306,000 in just the first year.
$306,000. I picture this as an everything squeeze. It's like being trapped in a room where the walls, the floor, and the ceiling are all shrinking toward you at the exact same time.
That's a great way to put it.
If it were just one bad piece of legislation, a family might be able to, tighten their belts and budget their way through it. But you cannot budget your way out of a $306,000 tariff hit while simultaneously losing your health care and watching billions burn overseas.
You can't. It's a structural collapse of affordability. And if we connect this to the bigger picture, that everything squeeze provides the perfect bridge to understand the ideological framework of the movement's messaging.
Okay, let's get into that framework.
Throughout the coalition documents, the central rallying cry is workers over billionaires. The organizers have fully adopted elite theory to explain their material conditions to the public.
Yeah, reading through these manifestos, the reliance on elite theory is glaring. And for you listening, if you're unfamiliar, this is the sociological framework arguing that society is fundamentally divided into two groups.
Right.
You have a small, unaccountable elite class, the billionaires, corporate executives, and political insiders who consolidate all the wealth and decision-making power. And on the other side is the vast majority, the working class, who are forced to bear the brunt of every economic crisis those elites create.
Exactly. And when the organizers frame the No Kings protests through that lens, it completely changes the nature of their demands. They aren't just asking for incremental policy tweaks anymore.
They want structural change.
Yes. When they demand taxing the rich to fund public schools and affordable housing, or ending a $25 billion a week war, they are directly challenging the power structure itself. They're arguing that the elites have voided the social contract, and therefore, the working class has no obligation to continue generating wealth for them.
And because the grievance is structural, the protesters are realizing that the old playbook just doesn't work. Like the elites can simply ignore a Saturday march. A weekend protest doesn't impact a billionaire stock portfolio.
Right. It doesn't hurt their bottom line at all.
Which brings us to one of the most fascinating strategic shifts detailed in the CEP report. The organizers aren't just guessing here. They are aiming for a highly specific, scientifically backed threshold of societal disruption.
Yeah, the reliance on the 3.5% rule is a major tactical evolution for them. This concept stems from the historical research of Harvard professor Erica Chenoweth.
Okay, break that down for us.
Well, after analyzing hundreds of political campaigns over the last century, her data revealed a remarkable pattern. Basically, no government has ever been able to withstand a movement that actively and continuously mobilizes 3.5% of its population.
So, translating that to the United States population, we're talking about roughly 11 to 12 million people.
Yes.
Which means they are incredibly close. I mean, they just hit an estimated 8 to 9 million in the March 28th action.
They are well within striking distance of that threshold. But Chenoweth's research comes with a massive, crucial caveat that the organizers are really trying to navigate right now.
What's the caveat?
The 3.5% rule is not about getting 11 million people to show up for a single weekend rally, hold up some clever signs, take a photo for social media, and then, go back to work on Monday.
Oh, right.
To actually force an administration's hand, that 3.5% must be engaged in ongoing, sustained non-cooperation and direct action.
See, that is the major friction point. It is one thing to march on a Saturday when you have the day off. It is an entirely different universe of risk to sustain non-cooperation on a Tuesday morning. How do everyday people actually sustain that kind of disruption without getting fired, losing their health insurance, or, in the case of federal workers, getting arrested?
And that is exactly where the movement transitions from just protest to tactical ingenuity. The Jacobin article in your stack details a brilliant historical example of this, the TSA brown bag sickout.
Oh man, the brown bag metaphor is such a perfect distillation of how workers navigate oppressive labor laws.
It really is. The concept works like this. Imagine someone drinking alcohol in public from a brown paper bag. A police officer walking by almost certainly knows it's alcohol.
Right.
But the bag provides just enough plausible deniability that the officer can choose to look the other way rather than go through the massive administrative hassle of making an arrest.
And thousands of TSA workers applied that exact logic to federal labor law.
Exactly. Because federal law strictly prohibits TSA agents from striking. Doing so can result in immediate termination and felony charges.
Which is terrifying.
Huge risk. But during a past government shutdown, when these agents were being forced to work for weeks without pay, they hit a breaking point. So they didn't officially declare a strike. Instead, they just started calling out sick en masse.
Which is essentially wildcat strike. They withdrew their labor collectively, but completely bypassed the official union leadership.
Right, which protected the union from being sued, while giving the individual workers that brown bag plausible deniability. I'm not striking. My throat just hurts.
I have a fever. I can't come in.
And the systemic impact of that was devastating. That sick out led to 3 to 6 hour wait times at major international airports.
Yep, the entire aviation economy started to buckle. And the government, acting like the police officer looking at the brown bag, chose to accept the sick calls rather than attempt to fire and prosecute thousands of highly trained security agents.
Because doing that would have permanently grounded air travel anyway.
It is just brilliant tactical maneuvering. And the sources show they aren't just looking at the TSA. They have a more recent, localized blueprint they're trying to scale up right now. The Minnesota action.
Yes. The Minnesota blueprint is heavily cited by the May Day organizers as their proof of concept. Back in January, in direct response to the aggressive deployment of federal ICE agents, organizers in Minnesota executed a unified statewide pause in daily economic activity.
We're talking about 100,000 people taking to the streets.
Yeah.
And they did this in negative 30-degree weather. I mean, that level of physical commitment alone speaks to the depth of the anger.
But the marches were only half the strategy. Critically, over 700 businesses closed their doors in solidarity. This wasn't just a vocal protest, it was a localized economic freeze.
And it worked.
It absolutely worked. The economic pain was so sharp that it led to tangible, immediate concessions. The DHS secretary was fired, and the number of ICE agents operating in the state was drastically reduced.
That Minnesota victory fundamentally shifted the psychology of the movement. It proved that sustained economic non-cooperation actually achieves results. Which brings us to the centerpiece of the current strategy.
Right.
The TSA sickout and the Minnesota freeze, those serve as the exact blueprints for what organizers are attempting to take nationwide on May 1st. We are literally watching the evolution from a protest movement into a general strike.
Yeah, and if we look at the rhetoric from Ezra Levin, the co-founder of Indivisible, the framing of May Day is exceptionally clear. He states that May 1st is not an endpoint. It is a tactical escalation and an economic show of force.
And the mandate being pushed across all these coalition documents is completely uncompromising. No work, no school, no shopping.
No shopping being a huge part of that.
Right. And what makes this particular call to action different is that it's bleeding out of grassroots activist circles and pulling in massive traditional institutions.
Yeah, that's a major shift.
The sources show that the Chicago Teachers Union, which is one of the most powerful labor forces in the country, they passed a formal resolution pushing for a day of civic action on May 1st. You even have the mayor of Chicago publicly supporting it, actively citing state laws that allow students an excused absence to participate in civic events.
The institutional backing is significant, for sure, but a nationwide general strike is a monumental undertaking. It is highly disruptive by design, and this is where we really have to engage with the pushback and contradictions found within your sources,
Because not everyone believes this is the right strategy.
or that it will even work.
The friction here is fascinating because it's coming from all sides. Let's start with the conservative counter-perspective, which was highly visible in the WTTW local news comment sections. The critics there raise a very practical concern, right? The no shopping mandate actively starves small local businesses that are already barely surviving the tariffs and the inflation we talked about earlier.
That's a very real fear. Furthermore, they view the ideological demands of the strike, specifically the calls to heavily tax the wealthy to fund public programs, not as civic justice, but as a communist message of forced wealth redistribution.
Right, so we're seeing deeply rooted ideological differences here.
Exactly. And the resentment over small businesses being used as collateral damage in an economic war is a very potent counter-narrative.
But the most piercing critique doesn't actually come from the political right, does it?
No, it doesn't.
The sharpest warning actually comes from the labor left itself.
Yes. The piece by Joe Burns on the labor site organizing.work provides a really critical reality check here. Burns warns against the proliferation of what he calls fake strikes.
Fake strikes.
Right. His core argument is that middle-class activists on social media cannot simply look at a calendar, declare a general strike, and expect the economy to halt.
Because a true strike requires profound vulnerability. I mean, if you just ask your manager for a vacation day so you go hold a sign at a rally, you aren't really striking. You are taking a sanctioned leave day. The company's bottom line isn't threatened at all.
Exactly. Burns emphasizes that a real strike means withdrawing your labor collectively to halt production. It requires deep, painful workplace organizing. It means risking your livelihood, your health insurance, and your ability to pay rent, all in order to force a demand.
Yeah, it's not a block party.
No. He cautions that calling a coordinated vacation day a strike dilutes the power of the tactic. It gives the illusion of resistance without applying any actual economic leverage.
So, to determine whether this movement will actually cross that 3.5% threshold with a true strike, or if it will just falter as a massive symbolic leave day, we have to objectively weigh the credibility and the inherent biases of our evidence room.
Right. That context is essential for anyone trying to analyze this situation. It is important to acknowledge that the stack of sources we're reviewing today leans heavily toward progressive, activist, and labor-friendly publications.
We're looking at outlets like Jacobin, Payday Report, Common Dreams, Daily Kos, and the Center for American Progress.
Right. These organizations are fundamentally sympathetic to the goals of the No Kings movement.
But they are.
And while they provide excellent, heavily researched data regarding crowd sizes and organizing logistics, their inherent bias is toward the success of the strike. They're actively analyzing the movement while simultaneously hoping it succeeds.
Which is exactly why the WTTW comments and Joe Burns' labor critique are so vital.
Yes, they provide the necessary friction to give us a realistic view of the massive obstacles this movement faces.
But even when filtering for those biases, the statistical realities anchoring these sources are basically undeniable. The two strongest data points that emerge from this deep dive are clear.
What stands out to you?
First, the magic number is 11 million Americans. That is the threshold required to trigger Erica Chenoweth's 3.5% rule for sustained societal disruption.
Yeah.
Second, the Payday Report cited that an astonishing 23% of Minnesota voters participated in some capacity during their statewide strike.
I mean, getting 23% of a state's voting population to participate in an unsanctioned economic freeze is a staggering metric of civic engagement.
It really is.
And it contextualizes the rhetoric we're seeing from leadership. Ezra Levin's statement that the next national action is an economic show of force aligns perfectly with the core, uncompromising slogan from the No Kings organizers themselves.
Which is, we don't do kings, not now, not ever.
Exactly.
So synthesizing all of this, how do we build a mental framework around what is happening? For you listening, if you're mapping this out, so you want to write an article or prep for a meeting optimized around the No Kings protests, we actually drafted a quick structural outline based on these sources.
Yeah, this is a great way to summarize it.
So here are the 6 points. Point 1, the title, the evolution of the No Kings protests, from marches to general strikes. Point 2, the introduction. You need to define the movement and highlight that March 28 record-breaking turnout of 8 to 9 million.
Point three is the economic drivers. Detail the impact of those $306,000 tariffs, the healthcare costs, and the whole workers versus billionaires dynamic of elite theory.
Exactly. Point 4 is the 3.5% threshold. Explain Erica Chenoweth's rule and the strategy of ongoing, sustained non-cooperation. Point 5, the May 1 escalation. You analyze the planned nationwide strike, but you make sure to address both the massive coalition support and the critiques of fake strikes.
And finally, point six, the conclusion. Summarize why the underlying economic crises ensure the movement's continued growth.
That framework perfectly captures the tension of this moment.
It really does. And to close out this analysis, I want to leave you with a deeply provocative thought from the HELU, the Higher Ed Labor United article in the Stack.
Okay, what do they note?
Well, in discussing the mechanics of a general strike, they observed that historically, a true successful general strike is not loud. It is, in their words, amazingly quiet.
Because it's literally just the sound of millions of people staying home.
Yes. We are so conditioned to associate political rebellion with noise, clashes, and visible chaos. But a general strike flicks that dynamic entirely. The weapon is the profound, devastating silence of empty roads, shuttered storefronts, and halted assembly lines.
Wow.
It raises a fascinating question to ponder as we approach May 1st. How does a government or an elite class suppress a rebellion when the rebellion consists entirely of millions of people staying home and doing absolutely nothing?
It is a chilling, powerful image. We started this deep dive talking about the noise of a movement. But what is coming next, if the organizers can actually pull this off and cross that 3.5% threshold, might just be the eerie, devastating quiet of an economy coming to a complete halt.
Truly something to watch.